In this podcast, I'll go over how to properly UV circular shells. So on this mesh right here, I'm going to assign a checkerboard texture. With the checkerboard texture, I've gone into the placement 2D node and set the repeats up to 2. This way the checkerboard will display more times and it'll be easier to see if there's any squashing and stretching. So auto map, I'm going to turn on the wireframe on shaded and move the shells off to the left-hand side. I find that it's easier to work with all of the shells off to the side instead of in the 0 to 1 space. I'm going to grab these edges and move and sew them together. Rotate them so that the checkers are flowing in the right direction. And before I work any further, I'm going to make sure that all of my edges are softened and hardened properly. I like to use the harden soften edge options at around 70. Any edges that are 90 degrees should have a hardened edge on them, and any edges that are round or should look more organic should be softened. This step should be completed before you even start UVing. Now that we have that finished, I'm going to delete history. I'm going to put the seam down here at the bottom where it's going to be less noticeable. Do a cut and then move and sew, and I'll move that off to the right. Next, I'll take the shells for this bolt, and we can see that there are 2 circular shells, and then there are additional shells that are already sewn together into a strip. We'll move these all down here so it's easier to see. Now I'm going to sew these together. Creating long strips fits better in the 0 to 1 space and also takes up less space. Having these circular shells, it's difficult to find something to fit inside. So after this is sewn, I'm going to grab all of the edges on the circular shells and cut. I'm then going to grab these edges here and do a move and sew. I missed one of them here, so we'll grab and do a cut again. Double click that edge and move and sew. So we're taking up significantly less space now. I'm going to grab in the center and do a move and sew in there as well. When I'm finished with it, I'm going to move that shell over to the right hand side and start working on the next piece. Now with these, they're bent. If you try to do a move and sew on that, they're going to sew crooked. So I'm going to take the align tools and make sure that all of these are aligned. I'm hitting G to straighten them out. And then when we do a move and sew, they'll sew straight on. I'm going to rotate that shell so that the checkers are running in the right direction and move on to this next bolt. I'm going to use the same technique as I did on the previous bolt. Grab all of the shells, sew together the ones that are already straight. I'll cut all of the edges and then move and sew each one. Sometimes you'll want to leave the edges that are not sewn together apart. Other times you'll want to do that final sew. It really depends on the model and if it's causing the checkers to skew at all. On this one, I'm going to try a cylindrical map. This is another option. I'm going to click on the little T and then rotate this around. You can also type in values here. I'll do a -90. And then with this row, I'm going to do an align up and an align down. We'll do a little bit of a scale, taking a look at the checkers to make sure that they are as square as possible, and then move on to the next bolt. Cut these edges. And then you can leave this or sew together if it doesn't cause stretching. This is the front cap. I'm going to just move off to the side. We don't need to adjust that at all. Rotate this. And this is our last bolt, cut, and then move and sew. Make sure that you're not scaling things up or down while you're doing this. Move and sew doesn't work well if one shell that's being sewn is a lot larger or a lot smaller than the other. Delete history, run a layout, make sure to set it to object and rotate. Everything will fit nicely in the 0 to 1 space. Rotate it all the way around, line it back up. Might need to scale it down just a little bit to fit in. Now I'm going to do a select using constraints to find any of the edges that have hardened normal. Make sure to set all in next and hard. And what that'll do is cut all of the shells that need a little bit of padding to them. Remember when you're UVing, if you have a hard edge that's a 90-degree angle and you do an actual normal hardened edge, there needs to be a shell split and a little bit of space. Any edge that has a bevel on it can be sewn together, but any edge that does have that split needs some space. So I'm just going to move each one of these shells so that there's a small space for us when we bake our normal mat. We won't have any shading issues. This also will not cause a problem when we go into Painter to create the texture. I'm going to scale these down just a little bit more so that there's space in between. We're going to move these. I like to do this after the layout so everything stays nicely organized. I'm going to unfold that to help with the stretching on the bevel. And we're good.